Hey guys, Toby Mathis here, and I get a question all the time from folks that have a US visa and they're wondering whether they can have a side business, whether they can invest. And there's so many different types of visas and so many different answers that I decided to bring in an expert, Hugo Serri. Welcome, first off.
Thank you very much, Toby. It's great to be here. And yes, immigration law is a very complex area, and questions they are all over the place, and it keeps on changing. It's one of the areas that is always subject to new administrations, new policies, and new objectives by the U.S. government. So it's very dynamic.
Perfect. Well, you're the right guy. So I kind of want to give your a background on you because you're not a typical lawyer. Like a lot of folks, they go US, go to college, they go to law school, they get a license, and that's what they do. In your case, you actually went to law school initially outside the United States, right? In am I right? Is it Rio de
Yes,
Janeiro?
Rio de Janeiro. Yes, yes,
And
that's
then
Rio
you,
de. Yes, please go ahead.
oh, and then you did it. Then you did two additional advanced degrees
Yes.
in other countries too, as well, right?
Yes, I first went to law school in Rio. I graduated in 1999. So just told folks my age, but it is what it is. And I always wanted, just like many of the folks that I help settle in the United States, I always wanted to study abroad. So I first went to the United Kingdom, to King's College London, and but I then I had the chance during a sabbatical period to go to the US. I briefly entertained the idea of doing an MBA, but I said, well, who am I fooling here? I like what I do. I think I like it so much that I went to law school 3 times. And I went to the University of Denver, and shortly after that, I took the bar exam, passed, and I became licensed. And I believe that this diverse background, the fact that I like to live abroad, I like different cultures, it was only natural that I would settle in immigration law.
And that's great because you live this, you lived it because you came to the United States, I'm sure on an education visa or something. It probably wasn't that you came in here to do work, and you were in the system, which is invaluable. I always believe it's really tough to teach out of a book. You got to have somebody that's actually done it, and you've done it. Um, Big question for you. So you work in immigration. I believe right now you're not in the United States, right? You're down in Brazil.
Yes, yes, I'm down in Brazil. There are many projects going on here. It's a bit of a sales approach also to speak to folks here directly. So the vast majority of my clientele comes from Brazil, although we have a significant number of Europeans and Central Americans in our books. But I decided to come here also to speak directly with clients. And these are people that I have served when I used to practice law in Brazil. And I can understand their concerns and their objectives. So, the person who wants to open their own business or expand their Brazilian operations into the US, and how they can send managers, executives, or researchers, and many other occasions, how they can simply take advantage of the fact that there are legal pathways to expand into the US.
That's this is great because you're well overqualified for what we're going to be asking you to do today, which is to break down like kind of the main visa types. A lot of people have heard of the H-1B and they hear about it in the news, and there are always people, you know, depending on which side of the political spectrum, they're pounding on one side or the other. But there's a bunch of other visas, and that's kind of what I do want to do first is let's go over the types of visas and what they are, and that way, if somebody's listening and they're like, that's me, they know you're going to get the answer to those three questions. So let's go over the main type of visas. What are the big ones?
Well, I think the first big division is between immigrant visas and non-immigrant visas. So, immigrant visas, for example, EB1A for a person with extraordinary abilities, EB2 and IW, a person with exceptional abilities and who's going to develop a proposed endeavor under certain conditions in the United States, or an EB5, a visa for an investor. Those visas, being immigrant visas, they are going to lead the person to a green card at a certain point in the foreseeable future. So in that case, when the person becomes a green card holder, a legal permanent resident, it means they can work to any employer. So they can continue their own business, they can add business to their portfolio. So in that situation, they are very likely, they have very likely the profile of the most predominant client of Anderson Consulting, because they can have a side hustle, they can have another investment, they can open an LLC, they can structure their businesses the way they want. On the other side, the non-immigrant visas, they are attached to certain circumstances that will most likely tie them to a given employer or a given business. And this is where it becomes very complicated, very tricky to have an additional investment, an additional venture, and how to structure that.
All right, and let's go over. So I just want to recap. So you got the EB1A, you have the EB2, and you have the EB5 that you just mentioned. Those are all immigrant visas. So the answer
Yes,
to the questions, can I have a second job, or can my spouse work in the US? Can I own and operate a side hustle, and can I invest in real estate and in the stock market? The answer to all three of those is a resounding yes, because
yes,
it is an immigrant visa. And then we get
exactly.
different answers when we go to, there's H1B, there's L1A, L1B, I believe E2, and the O1A. I
Yes.
just listed out a bunch. Are those the visas that are the non-immigrant visas?
Yes, those are non-immigrant visas, and they are tied to certain conditions related to either an employer or a certain investment, a certain business the person is developing. So the H-1B, for example, people of specialty occupations. So let's think about an engineer, a software engineer. So it's a kind of person that has the knowledge, the exposure, and the drive to look for, let's say, crypto assets. And so the person knows how to navigate that world. And it's only natural that this person may think about, for example, creating an LLC to have all their investments under that LLC. The problem is the moment this LLC is created, the person will probably just go down the route of becoming a manager of that company and becoming maybe the sole proprietor of that company. And in that situation, he's going to put himself in a position of virtually working for a different company in addition to the one that is sponsoring his visa. I think it's highly unadvisable because immigration services, although they may understand in theory that, oh, I understand this is just a company to hold your assets, but you are actually working for a company. So the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services is going to look to the substance over the structure. So it doesn't matter exactly how the person does that. This can be tricky in the same situation as the L1A or L1B. So the L's are for intercompany transferees. The L1A is directed to managers and executives who are coming from a qualified company abroad, qualified in the sense of it's either affiliated with an American company or it's a subsidiary or the parent of an American company. So when they come to the US, they come to work for that company in that same capacity. And then they are again tied to that specific work visa. And having that structure can be complicated for that person. In the same situation, the L1B is a person of specialized knowledge. Let's say it's a researcher in the area of biotechnologies. They developed a vaccine or a sophisticated exam in their home country, and they come to the US to continue that line of work. Again, they are tied to that company. Same as with the O1A, a person with extraordinary abilities in the area of business, they come to work for a specific company, and the E2s, who are people from certain countries who have certain treaties in the United States, and they come to direct and develop a business in the United States. But when it gets more complicated is that, of course, not all visas are born equal. It's a vast system. It's highly complex, and it's always the landscape is always shifting.
So
So yes.
I was going to say, let's break it down because we have the three big questions that we want to answer. So we know that the H1B specialty occupation, you're coming here to work. In that particular case, so our first question was, can I have a second job, or can my spouse have a second job or a job in the US? So let's say I came over an H1B and I bring my spouse. Is that what I do? Is I bring them as a dependent?
Yes, they come as a dependent. So in the H-1B case, the spouse is going to have an H-4 visa.
Can
Um,
either one of us pick up a second job? Can we go be a bartender on the weekend? Can my spouse pick up a second job somewhere?
Unfortunately, the answer would be no, because unless you are in a very specific circumstances and the person is already at the end of the H-1A and he's applying for adjustment of status, but that's a very specific one. Generally speaking, no. So the H-1B is tied to the employer that sponsored their visa, and the H-4, the spouse, cannot work.
Okay.
So having a second job would be a typical job would be, the question would be no.
All right. So that's very clear. So then the second question is, can I have a side hustle? So let's say I came here. I'll use my brother-in-law as an example. He comes here on an education visa, not an education. He's an H-1B to teach. He's a teacher, multilingual in a specific school district. He's brought in. Can he go be a bartender on the weekend, or can he set up a side hustle? You already answered that, bartender. He can't. But can he set up a side hustle? Could he flip houses on the side?
Well, that could be very tricky. I would say unless there's a very specific circumstance where there is a company that does the house flipping and he buys a small percentage of the company. Let's say he has 10% of the interest and he's not actively engaged in the business. So he's not going out there selecting houses, picking up the phone, speaking to contractors. It's much more about substance. So if he's making decisions, picking up the phone and working on the weekends and engaging with, the painter, the flooring guys, and on, he's going to be seen in a position where he is working, as opposed to having a stake in the company, just like, for example, having Apple stocks or Microsoft stocks. I mean, he owns a part of the company, but he doesn't work on it.
Yes. So let's break that down then. So there's the first question was, can he have a side job? The answer is no.
Mm-hmm.
And if he had a dependent spouse, the answer is no. Then the second question is, can he own and operate a business? The answer is no if he's the operator. But then the third question is, could he invest in stocks or real estate? And it sounds like the answer is yes on that third one, that he could be a passive owner in a business. So let's say we had a flipping business and it was in his backyard and he said, boy, I'd like to invest in that. He could do that, but he can't go pick up a hammer and start working in that business or act as a manager of that business. Am I getting it right?
Yes, you're getting it right. I would say in general terms, but what typically happens, and I've seen it happening more than once, unfortunately, is when you have one business of these dimensions, so a couple of folks, three maybe, are going to start a business, a house flipping business. And so they usually do it just by themselves. So you don't have outside investors. And just like in any small business, the initial investors, they're going to get their hands on the job. And that's the issue. So I think it's very hard to convince immigration services that a person who has 33%, 30% of a business is not really engaging on it when the business is managed by, a cousin or another friend. So I would be very cautious, and I'll probably seek counsel before making decisions, before filing paperwork, so you can be really on the safe side.
I would say that right away, guys, I'm going to put Hugo's information into the show notes. You can just reach out to him directly. Hugo, I'll share it so you don't have to tell everybody your phone number and things like that. We'll put it down in the show notes so somebody can reach out to you.
All right.
Guys, when you get into the gray areas, the issue isn't, am I right? It's, is it going to cause me an issue with the immigration official who's going to revoke the visa? So is the juice worth the squeeze? And so what I'm hearing from you, Hugo, is if it's three people and we're doing something, even if you are passive, you might have a tough time convincing an immigration official that you're passive. And so is it fair to say that the more people that are invested in a business and the smaller stake you have, the better under those circumstances?
I would say generally, yes, because it tends to show that the business is being managed by someone else. In most situations, the manager doesn't even have to be a member of the business. So it's someone else that has been hired professionally, and the person receives correspondence from time to time and say, well, we had a good quarter or a bad quarter, or there will be dividends or there won't be dividends. So he is far from the business. He's just owning an asset, owning a piece of the business. And that is very likely because, again, a number of folks who are eager to work, they got the will, they got the knowledge, and they begin a business in the area of services. And it's only natural they will engage in the activities of the business. They will conduct, they will be working.
Yeah, and when we were talking off camera. In full disclosure, I've talked to Hugo about this stuff a bunch. He's actually, I think you're a client of Anderson. So like we've met each other. I've talked to you multiple times. But you were telling me a little bit about a gal that had an Instagram side business. She was cleaning houses on the side, and she went in for a meeting with an
Yeah.
immigration official. Is that? Can you share that just so people understand how
Yes.
ticky tacky this stuff could be?
Yes. This person was, I guess, on a student visa, or was changing the status from tourist to student, which you can do, provided that you are compliant with all the requirements. But she also had a cleaning business. She had an Instagram page for it, and she presented herself as a CEO of her own business. And one of the outcomes of a given application with immigration services is that they may issue an RFE, a request for evidence. And the officer was asking her about that business and why she had that business and why she was presenting herself as a CEO. So that's a big problem because
Did
the
did
person is working in violation of her status.
did she lose her visa?
I Unfortunately, I don't think she went forward with the change of status.
Oof, that's horrible. And that was a
Yeah,
student where you can't work at all
yeah,
if you're on a student visa,
yeah.
right? If you
That was
come
a
here,
student.
you just can't work.
Yeah, I saw
All right,
this other
so
one. Yeah, I'm sorry.
no, please go
Yeah,
ahead.
there was this other one that was even maybe more dramatic because the wife had a work visa. She was changing for this work visa, and the husband was her dependent. So he was just going with her to a different situation that would allow, better place and more planning on the journey. He received a request for evidence, and only him asking about one given business that it wasn't construction business, and he had signed tens of checks paying the folks that worked for the business. He could not explain who were the people who were actually managing the business. He could not provide any of that information. And this was very sad because you had a situation where spouses were in different situations and there is little that can be done,
Yep, you lose it. All
if at
right,
all.
so I wanted to go back. So if you're keeping score at home, H-1B, can't have a job, your spouse can't have a job, you can't have an owner operated business, but you can invest in the US stock market, you can invest in real estate, uh, probably not Airbnb and flipping and being a dealer, but like passive real estate
Mhm.
syndications, things like that. If you're doing it on your own, make sure you are reaching out to somebody like Hugo first, because you want to make sure that you don't step on any landmines and cause yourself pain. Now let's go to the L1A, L1B. These are intercompany transfers, right? This is the parent or subsidiary situation where you're coming over on behalf of an employer. Maybe they own a subsidiary, or the international company owns a subsidiary in the United States, and you're being transferred over, right? Can I
Yes.
have a second job, or can my spouse have a second job if I'm on that type of visa?
So the person who was brought to the United States, that executive manager or the employee with specialized knowledge, should not have a second job. But the spouse, this is the curious situation. This is how immigration law can be so complex. So the spouse has an L2 visa, and they can work. They actually don't even need an employment authorization document because their work authorization is incidental to their visa. And this is
Ah,
why it's so important. You see, in the two cases, both are coming to be employees of a company. They were sought by the company to come to the US to, develop a certain function and this and that. They are highly important. Both have probably the same level of education. But then you have this big division of situations. In one of
and
them, the spouse can work, the other one, they can't. So in that situation, let's say, well, there's a house flipping or something going on. There's a business I want to invest. Okay, the spouse can do that without concerns. But again, the limitations to that person to be, engaged in the business, investing on it, then we begin to reach an area where, we have to err on the side of caution.
that's unusual. This is why, again, guys, don't go it alone. Talk to somebody who knows this stuff. All right. So that was question one. So it sounds like if I'm the worker who got transferred, no, don't get a second job. Don't work as a bartender on the weekends. But my spouse can do what he or she wants to do as far as employment. That takes us to the second question, which is, can I, the person that's got the visa, the L1A or L1B, can I have a side business? I open up Toby's pizza shop. Can I do that? And or can my spouse do that? And I'm just going to help you so you don't have to worry about. I'm an owner operator. I'm actually operating the business, so I'm working in it. So am I restricted same way as I can't work? I can't do that as well.
Well, it's a bit of a gray area because, again, if, let's say if you only have the spouses owning the business, so it's very likely it's going to be the typical 50-50%. So in that situation, even if the spouse who is allowed to work is the manager of the business, I think it can be a close call from certain angles because, for example, well, a person who has 50%, they don't have control, but they have negative control. So in the sense that any decision has to be taken by both of them. So I would be very concerned about how it develops. And for example, decisions are being taken in the business. Say the business is terribly successful and they move forward, this is going on. And all of a sudden they make a decision, oh, should they expand it to this direction? Should we hire this person? Should we add an area to the business? And then you may find yourself in a situation where they're exchanging messages, emails, or signing papers together. I would be very cautious with that.
Would you have the spouse be the sole owner, set it up as a business structure, and keep the person who's the main visa holder? Because it sounds like the spouse would also be on a visa, but a different type.
Yes.
Would you do that? And you say the spouse is the owner, the spouse is the only one that touches this business.
Well, yes, I would say the spouse who is allowed to work would be the sole owner of the business. But they would probably have to, speaking further with Anderson, maybe with a family attorney to make sure that things are on the right direction when one spouse owns the business by themselves.
Interesting. All right. So now we have third question was L1A, L1B. Can they invest in like the US stock market? Can they buy into syndications and do rental real estate? Are there restrictions there?
I would say generally, when it comes to stock market investments, let's say something your bank manager is offering you, the answer is yes, because those are just connected to your bank accounts, and there's nothing special about it. When it comes to real estate for rental, that can be a bit tricky because let's say they buy one first property, a house in the mountains of, Colorado, Utah, and most folks will have the house on an LLC, and the couple is going to own it 50-50, a joint tenancy with rights of survivorship. But if they engage on the management of that house, of the mountain cabin, it can be complicated. But let's say if they have a company that manages that for them, post the ads on Airbnb and whatnot, and have everything going on, that can be less complicated because of that side. But at the same time, if they own it through an LLC, there's going to be an operating agreement. There's going to be managers, going to be a few decisions. Also, because they have to have some formalities to take advantage of the asset protection side of it. So that is where it gets tricky. So
You want to
it's
make sure, you, I'm just going to say, you want to make sure you're working with somebody who's documenting this stuff along the way. Does, again, when you go in for a request for evidence or an exam, is that what they're looking for? Was there a professional that helped you? What was the engagement? Who was it for? What was it? Are those the questions they're asking?
Yes, they're going to be asking for questions relating to the substance and what actually happens in that particular structure. So, of course, a person can buy a property. Let's say, well, my H-1B period is over. I'm leaving the United States, but I like this property here. I'm going to keep it rented. It's fine. They can do that, regardless of being allowed to work or not, or working for a single company or not. But when it becomes a business, and again, well, if we are having an LLC, we want to take advantage of all the protections, and you cannot have it both ways, because if it's a business for the asset protection side of it, it's going to be seen as a business from the immigration perspective as well. That's why it's so important before taking those decisions, consulting with an immigration attorney and a tax attorney or corporate attorney to see exactly where the best possible structure would be.
Yeah. And making sure that you're documenting along the way. I think it would go a long
Yeah.
ways to say,
Yeah.
hey, this is in the retention was specifically this, and there was an acknowledgement that the spouse could not be participating, things like that. All right. So then let's get to there's two more types of visas I want to hit. There's the E2. That's the investor visa. That's where I'm coming here to invest in something, and I'm going to be managing that particular enterprise, right? They know you're going to be working. Can I have a second job outside of that, or am I just focused on my E2?
That's a very interesting question because the E2 has a certain particularity. So the person is coming to the US under an E2 because they are citizens of a country with a given treaty with the US. So when they come to direct and develop a business, let's say the person has a small hotel. And of course, it is expected that in the beginning, they're going to be in the reception, they're going to be helping cleaning or, tidying up the rooms and doing a number of things. But they are expected to put themselves in a position where developing and directing the business means that they are not competing with an ordinary American worker. They're not competing with a receptionist, they're not competing with a cleaning person. But when they begin to direct and develop, of course, in general, they are focused on their enterprise only. But that enterprise can grow and can have a stake on another enterprise. So they may be in a position where the business is successful. And you know what? The hotel, we identified a new construction here, let's say in the mountains again. There are going to be some townhouses here. This is an interesting opportunity. Well, we're going to have an LLC. That LLC could be generally owned 100% by the same enterprise that he came to direct and develop initially. So it's not that you have to be tied to that enterprise. You have to direct and develop again, but you can expand those businesses. So by expanding that means your operation is being successful, and you can be in a very comfortable situation where you own those assets that generate income, but actually your enterprise owns them. But the interesting thing is, let's say in the beginning, just like in the E2, you have to engage in a number of everyday tasks. The E2 spouse can work. So the spouse can be the person who is going to be initially taking care of that side of the business until I say, you know what, let's bring somebody else in and let's incorporate this and let's have this as a subsidiary. So it gives you that flexibility, which is a very interesting visa for that purpose.
All right, but I couldn't have a job on the weekend. Let's say I'm doing this and I'm like, oh man, this is sucking up all my money. I need to make some extra money. I'm starting to run a little low, or I'm a little worried. Could I go pick up a job at the local grocery store as a bartender or anything like that? Could I go have a second job, W-2 for somebody else?
I would not do that because you would be essentially working for an employer that is
Mm-hmm.
different from the entity that first brought you into the United States. So I would
All right.
not take a side job.
What about my spouse? Could they do it?
Yes, the E2 spouse could work.
All right. Now we got somewhere. So you got to say, hey, I'm doing this. I'm stuck with what I'm investing in. That's where my energy is put. I don't want to start going off and renting myself out or working for somebody else, but my spouse could go do it if they were in that situation. I doubt they would be in that situation, but let's just say, all right, how about a second business? Can they own and operate a second business that's unrelated to the E2, the investor visa business?
That's a big gray area because, well, it is a not. So simply owning a second business, I would probably on the no side of it. But let's say the initial E2 business grew and is successful, and it's contemplating buying. Let's say the person has a restaurant and they're contemplating buying uh, a small grocery shop that is known to have good products, who sources from local producers. So, well, you know what? I'm going to cut the supply chain here and I'm going to buy that. But if the company buys it, we
Mm-hmm.
have a chance to be on the safe side because his operations are, ABC, whatever that brought him is now expanding. But if he goes and buys by himself, so no, I know there's different stuff here. This is profitable there. I'm going to be, dedicating more time to the other business, the grocery, than the restaurant. Then it's going to be a big problem.
Yeah. And then the spouse, could my spouse go out again and start up a house cleaning business on the side or a pizza shop on the side or whatever the business is. Could my spouse go do something and have a side business to help us generate money?
Yes, the E2 spouse, the spouse of an E2 visa holder would be in a favorable situation for that. They could go out there and seek opportunities. Yes.
All right. And then it's fair to say that I can invest. I could still invest in the US stock market. I could still invest in passive real estate investments, syndications, things like that.
Yes, I would say generally yes, unless there's something very particular in one given investment that I'm not seeing right now. But generally speaking, yes, a person can own stocks and have a portfolio just like anyone who was working with a bank manager, for example.
All right. And just remember, guys, because some folks are going to hear E2 and they're going to go, what about EB5 again? Okay, that's an immigrant visa. The answer is yes on all three questions. You could do stuff when you're an immigrant visa. We're talking about the non-immigrant visas, and we're just hitting four big ones. I want to go over the extraordinary abilities, the O&A, if you're willing to kind of go over that
Yes,
one. So what's a typical O&A person look like? Is that an athlete or is that something
it
along
can be
those
an
lines?
athlete, but the cases I have most contact with are those people with extraordinary abilities in business. So they are coming to the US because the O1A, the sponsor, the company, is applying for them to come to the US for up to 3 years. And they're going to work for that specific business developing it. But they have to show uh, employee employer relationship. So just because of that, we can already see that the person is tied to that particular entity, that particular business. So they cannot go out there and find a side hustle, and their spouse cannot work. They're going to be on an O3 visa. So this is where it really gets tricky. You see the L1A, L1B, and E2, they're going to be in a much more favorable situation than the H1B and the O1A. The system is complex. Sometimes it's different times. Congress came up with different solutions, different political circumstances. This is why it's so important to um, discuss these with counsel before you make decisions.
So O&A, I'm here as a worker for somebody because I have extraordinary abilities, and the IRS says, no, don't get a side hustle, don't do a side
No,
job. Your spouse can't have a side hustle. You can't have no side hustles, no side jobs. You're here for one thing, and that is because this employer says you have extraordinary ability. That's your world is right there. Can
yes.
can that same individual invest in the US stock market and passively invest in real estate in the United States?
Yes, again, they could invest, they could buy stocks, for example. Well, Apple is good, Nvidia, you name it, they're going to buy it. Uh, they could, for example, buy a property that they want to rent, but I would be very cautious when the decision is made, and especially how to structure that business. If you're going to have the property in an LLC, how this is going to work, who are your partners? Because in that situation, the O3, so the O1A and the O3 spouse, neither of them can work outside those conditions. The spouse can't work. The O1A cannot work outside the conditions of his visa. So that can be a bit tricky depending on how they develop and they want to structure their investments.
Well, this has been extremely helpful. I know it's not as straightforward as everybody would like. Sometimes you just want a yes, no, yes, no. It sounds like we're pretty darn close, though. So we have to the three questions I asked earlier is can I have a second job or can my spouse work in the US? Can I own and operate a side hustle? And three is can I invest in real estate or stocks in the US? The answer to those for immigrant visas, the EB1A, the EB2, and the EB5 is yes, you can do those three things. Then it gets, when we get to the non immigrant visas, if I'm understanding you correctly, it sounds like the H1B and the O1A have a lot more restrictions than the L1A and B and the E2. And but the answer to those questions is a flat no when it's H1B and O1A for at least the can I have a second job or can my spouse work? The answer could be a yes on those if it's L1A and E2. Can I own a second business? It really depends on whether you're actively participating. If you're the visa holder, chances are big no's. There's possible wiggle room in that L1A, L1B, and the E2. And then when you get to the passively owned, it sounds like anybody can passively own U.S. stock market in U.S. There was no restrictions that I heard on any of these: EB1A, EB2, EB5, the H1B, the L1A, L1B, the E2, and the O1A. They sound like all of those you could invest, and you could be an investor in the stock market or in passive real estate. Did I summarize that correctly?
Yes, yes, you did. I mean, generally is that it's interesting because I was trying to think about what is the most lawyerish answer to any questions. Is it depends or yes and no? Because this is where we are. It's a combination of depends and yes and no with most of these cases. So this is why it's so complex, as opposed to the examples of the EB1A, EB2 NIWs, and EB5. Well, the person became a legal permanent resident. They have a green card. They can work for any employer. So they're on the safe side. But the other ones, they are tricky. So generally speaking, yes, we're there. But of course, it's each case is different.
Yeah, and
Each person is different. Yes.
and it sounds like the tourists and the student visas are hard nosed on at least the you can't have a job and you can't have a side hustle. It
Oh
sounds like
yes, those are hard
you
nosed.
just yeah. So forget about it. You're like the H1Bs. You're a hard pass, but you could still have investments on the side with everybody. Hey, Hugo, I'll put your information in so people can go ahead and reach out. And then if you're willing to, when I post this on the YouTube channel, people put in comments and they ask questions. Are you willing to go look at those comments time to time from time to time and maybe answer a few questions?
I will do. It's going to be a pleasure. It's
All
great.
right, then guys, this is what you do. If you have a question, post it in the comments. If you have a scenario, again, Hugo's not your lawyer. He is a lawyer. Same thing with me. But you can go ahead and get some general advice and get some of your questions. Get the 10,000-foot view, and then I'll put Hugo's information so you can reach out to him directly. Here's the other thing I ask you guys to do if you could. Please subscribe and like. And if you know somebody who is going through something, or you have a relative, or you know somebody that you're worried about that's maybe a visa holder and you're worried that they might make a mistake or they've asked this question, share this video with them, because I think Hugo, you did a great job going through the different types of visas and answering some the questions that I get all the time. So I think this would be helpful for just about anybody.
Thank you so much, Toby. It's a great pleasure to collaborate with you. I mean, I really appreciate your guys' work. I think there's a lot of synergy, and I'm more than happy to come back and develop some more ideas with you.
That's a good one to leave with. If you have a question that you'd like us to do a video on with immigration, we can use Hugo and get him back as a contributor from time to time. I just really appreciate you taking the time while you're traveling to actually spend some time educating folks. I really appreciate it. Thanks, guys. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys later.